All right, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Lindsay Thompson, and I'm the director of the Delaware Maryland Agribusiness Association and serve as chair of the Delaware Maryland 4R Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm gonna go over the agenda for this morning. And so first we'll have our welcome and some introductions. Amy Jacobs from the Nature Conservancy, who serves on our steering committee as well, will do an overview of the mission and structure. Eric Rosenbaum is joining us from the Pennsylvania 4R Alliance and Rose Tree Consulting to talk about the results of our 2021 split nitrogen cost share program. I will give you all a brief update on the National Fish and Wildlife Grant that we have and some opportunities for both agribusinesses and farmers that are available. Amy's also going to talk about an opportunity from a grant from the Chesapeake Bay Trust. And then we'll take a short break before we turn it over to Amy Schober with the University of Delaware to talk to us about barriers to access and use of poultry litter. We are pleased to have Jason Trondle join us from the Fertilizer Institute to talk about a hot topic, current market factors that are affecting fertilizer pricing and availability. And then we will have some time for any new business and discussion. If you are able to identify yourself in the participant list, so if you open up the participant list and go over to more, you can edit, you rename yourself with your name and your affiliation. That would be helpful for us to keep track of attendance. And so at this point, I am going to have the members of the steering committee introduce themselves. So again, my name is Lindsay Thompson. I serve as the chair. Janelle.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Janelle Eck McHenry, and I work for the Delaware Maryland 4R Alliance as the program's NPR director.
All right. Elizabeth Hoffman.
Good morning, Elizabeth Hoffman with the Maryland Department of Agriculture. I work with the Program Planning and Evaluation Program, and I'm the coordinator for that.
And Mike Twining.
Morning, Mike Twining, Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Willard Agri-Service.
And Todd Hunsaker.
Morning, everyone. Todd Hunsaker, Growmark FS. I focus on precision ag on the Delmarva, Eastern PA, and New Jersey.
Amy Schober.
Hi, I'm Amy Schober. I'm a professor and extension specialist with the University of Delaware, focusing on nutrient management and environmental quality.
Not able to join us today is Chris Broche from the Delaware Department of Agriculture. He's the nutrient management administrator there and is understandably hunkered down dealing with avian influenza, an outbreak that we're experiencing here on the shore. And so I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Amy Jacobs to give us a quick overview of the 4R Alliance for those of you that are not familiar with our organization.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. I am Amy Jacobs. I am the Chesapeake Agriculture Program Director for the Nature Conservancy. And I'm going to try to share a few slides here. Which do you guys see, like the regular slides, or are you seeing the presenter view?
You're good.
Good. Okay, excellent. So the Delaware Maryland 4R Alliance is a partnership, and specifically it's an industry-led partnership to increase the adoption of 4R practices on farms in Delaware and Maryland. And the Nature Conservancy is really excited to be part of this collaboration because we fully embrace that our industry and our agricultural and trusted advisors are the ones that are supporting farmers across the region and can best help them to adopt these more advanced practices that have both an environmental benefit, as well as an economic benefit and a social benefit. So under the framework of the 4 R's that was developed by the Fertilizer Institute, it's focused on thinking about nutrient management as a system of practices and techniques that you use, including thinking about the right source at the right rate, the right time, and the right place to be able to get a variety of benefits for both sustaining agriculture on the in Maryland and Delaware. I always want to say Delmarva, but we're both Maryland, Delaware now, and also having both environmental and economic benefits for the operations. And we are, the way that we're organized is that we are under and one of the members of the Mid-Atlantic 4R Nutrient Stewardship Association. And several years ago, we went through the process of creating a standalone 501c3 nonprofit organization as the Mid-Atlantic 4R. And then under that, both the Delaware Maryland 4R Alliance as well as the Pennsylvania 4R Alliance are members of that nonprofit, and we operate under the auspices of that nonprofit. And in Delaware, Maryland, we have a variety of members from various both agribusinesses, researchers, state, federal, and local agencies and nonprofits. And Lindsay went through our steering committee that we have in place now that helps to meet regularly and keep our work on track and to be able to set our goals and evaluate our goals for the year. And under the strategic plan that we're currently operating, we have 5 goals that we're working for as a partnership. So one is increasing the understanding of the environmental and economic benefits of 4R practices that guide the implementation and advancement of 4Rs in our region. We have partners and external stakeholders become advocates for the expansion of 4R practices to meet our environmental and economic goals. That farmers expand field-specific adoption of 4R practices. That we better understand the current levels of 4R adoption so that we can identify other opportunities to expand implementation. And that the 4R Alliance energizes our members to work together and advance the Alliance and our goals. And as you will hear today, I think throughout the meeting, we'll give you updates on how we're working toward all of these through various projects that the partnership is undertaking. Oh, all right, and I'm stopping there for now. All right, I'll turn it back to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Amy. So as we go along, if you have questions, please feel free to either raise your hand with the reactions function at the bottom of the Zoom meeting, or you can enter those questions into the chat as well. If you look at the chat, Janelle has put in the link for the Delaware Nutrient Management credits. There is a quiz associated with the Delaware Nutrient Management credits that you must take, and you're free to do as we go along. And later in the program, we will also include the link for you to sign in for the Maryland credits as well as Certified Crop Advisor credits. So at this juncture, I am going to turn it over to Eric Rosenbaum with Rose Tree Consulting to talk to us about the split nitrogen application results.
Good morning, everybody. Am I able to share my screen here? There we go. Okay. Yeah, my name is Eric Rosenbaum. I kind of wear 2 hats when I talk to organizations. I'm an agronomist with Rose Tree Consulting, also serve as the executive director of the PA 4R Alliance. Here in Pennsylvania, we were very much involved in the 2020 NIFWIF project that the Mid-Atlantic 4R Alliance was able to obtain. So we work on some of the pillars, and Janelle and Lindsay in Maryland and Delaware work on other pillars. The pillar that I'm most involved in is the split nitrogen project, which is one of two projects that Pennsylvania 4R Alliance has going on this year. We also had a NRCS SIG project to compare nitrogen modeling with nutrient management plans, and we'll have the results of that project available to everybody here in the next couple of months. But today I wanted to talk mostly about our involvement in the split nitrogen project, and I think there's going to be some presentations on the other pillars within that NIFWIF project later on this morning. So Amy had the same slide up in her presentation, but with the 4R strategy, we're really looking at trying to focus on best management practices that farmers can do that have both an economic and an environmental outcome as well as a social outcome. So we feel like the split applications fits very well within that strategy of providing economic return to farmers as well as environmental outcomes to the Chesapeake Bay. So the NIFWIF grant that we're working under, there were 5 pillars: barriers to 4R adoption, 4R assessment, split application studies, manure transport exchanges, and lastly, partnership growth. And you'll hear more about all those pillars either today or in future presentations from the Mid-Atlantic 4R Alliance. But we're super excited to have this project, and we're even more excited to share some of the results with you and what we found in year 1 for the split application project. So this is a 3-year project. 2021 was year 1. We're now going into year 2, and we'll be able to offer the same program to farmers going into 2023 as well. What we wanted to do in 2021 is work with a small amount of farms and make sure that we could get our project set up correctly, that information flows back to us from the participants and payments flow back to the participants after the project has been completed. So in Pennsylvania, we focused on looking at all the nitrogen applied before the corn comes out of the ground versus some of the nitrogen being applied before the corn comes out of the ground and some of the nitrogen being applied after the corn is emerged. So looking at 100% pre-emerged nitrogen versus 1 split application. In Maryland, Janelle and Lindsay were focused on looking at 2 split applications. So some of the nitrogen put on before the corn came out of the ground, and then 2 applications after the corn was emerged. And so we had 16 farms that were enrolled in our pilot project, and it came to just about 3,600 acres. With this project, what we did in 2021 and what we'll do moving forward, we will reimburse farmers $15 an acre for implementing an additional split on their farm. We have to have at least 40 acres from a participant, and we're going to cap it at 400 acres per participant. There is some criteria that participants have to meet. They have to make sure that they meet regulatory compliance on enrolled acres. They have to provide some information to work through as the year goes along. But that's kind of what we were looking at in 2021, just making sure that we had everything set up and that things flow smoothly for participants this year and next year. When we started talking to participants, one of the questions that they would ask us is, what constitutes a split application? Eric, I'm interested in participating in this program. Tell me a little bit about what a split application is. So this is the list of split applications that our 2021 participants made through the project this year. And it's not like each participant was adopting this whole entire list, but if I took a look at all of the participants we had last year, these are the type of applications that they were making on their cornfields. They were doing manure applications, and sometimes the manure was in the fall, sometimes it was in the spring. We had a couple of participants that were putting nitrogen on in a strip till application prior to corn planting. We had a lot of people do a pre-emergent broadcast application with their burn down herbicides. We had planter applied nitrogen. We had a couple of different side dress applications that participants would do. The early side dress application, when that occurred, it was mostly a dry blend application of urea, ammonium sulfate, and potash. And some of our dairy farm cooperators would adopt that practice when the corn was pretty small. Then we have your traditional side dress application timing, which is knee-high corn. And then we had our late side dress application, which is people tinkering around with Y drops or pre-tassel applications. And then we also had some participants that were doing fertigation applications through their center pivot irrigations. So those are the types of split applications that participants were using. And we're not limiting participants to this list. If people come to us with a different kind of split application that they want to try, we're open to it. We just need to make sure that they're meeting some of the basic criteria laid out in the project. And really what it comes down to is, if you had a nutrient management plan, and at the end of that nutrient management plan, you needed to put on 100 pounds of nitrogen in the form of supplemental fertilizer to your field, we still need to make sure that no matter how many splits we're adopting, we're still applying that 100 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer. And I think that's a common mistake that people think of when they think about split applications. We're not talking about increasing nitrogen rates. We're talking about using that same nitrogen rate and just dividing it among more applications. That's an important point that I want people to understand when we talk about split applications. So in Maryland, we had 5 farms that were participating in 2021. The average increase in yield was 19.2 bushels per acre on those 5 farms. It's a pretty astounding number. When I think of the yield increases or the yield benefits to split applications here in Pennsylvania, I probably would not think of 19.2 as a number off the top of my head. I'd probably think of half that as maybe the average response to a split application, but depending on the year, depending on the soil type, depending on a lot of the environmental conditions, certainly 19.2 bushels is possible, but that was the average. It was the average increase. We had some farms where they had a 30 bushel increase, and we had some farms where they had a 2 bushel increase. It really just depended on the site and the site-specific characteristics of that field. If we talk about nitrogen use efficiency, because it's all well and good to have a yield increase of 19.2 bushels, we get the economic benefit of increased revenue for farms. We're lowering our per unit nitrogen costs for that farmer, and we're increasing nitrogen use efficiency by 5%. So that's an important number from a water quality perspective. And basically what that number says is that we know corn still takes a pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn, but we're producing that bushel of corn with less than a pound. All right, we're increasing that nitrogen use efficiency, or reducing that amount of nitrogen per bushel, we're lowering that by some percentage. And in this case, the adoption of that additional split on these farms resulted in a 5% increase in the nitrogen use efficiency. So in Pennsylvania, we had 11 farms participate. It was just over 2,400 acres and 17.6 bushel increase. So again, in Adams County, which is where we did our pilot project, we were comparing 100% of the nitrogen applied before the corn comes up versus split applying that nitrogen and putting some on the field before the corn comes up and putting the remainder on after the corn comes up. The majority of that nitrogen applied after the corn came up went on when the corn was about 15 inches tall or knee high, but average increase 17.6 bushels on participating sites. In Pennsylvania, nitrogen use efficiency increased by 12%, which is a pretty big number. So we're really happy to see that the farmers in Adams County were able to adopt a split application and increase their nitrogen use efficiency by 12%. So wanted to dive into just one example that we have, and this is the type of information that we were able to gather from our participants. And as we move forward in 2022 and 2023, we'll be collecting this same information. So we're looking at an old dairy farm here with an older corn planter. They don't have the ability to do a pop-up fertilizer. They don't have the ability to do a 2x2 starter fertilizer. It's continuous corn, so there's no legume history. It's an old dairy farm, so there's a little bit of manure history that we take into consideration when we do a nutrient management plan for the farm. They don't have cows anymore, so we're not planning any manure applications. And in the control, they put 130 pounds of nitrogen on up front with their burn down herbicides. In the split, they did 65 pounds with the burn down herbicides. Then they came back at side dress and they did 200 pounds of a 340012S, which was an application that Growmark had made for them. So the total nitrogen load in both the control and the split, right around 150 pounds. Yield, 160 bushels in the control, 194 bushels in the split, 34 bushel increase in yield simply by adjusting the timing of our nitrogen applications, right? We didn't increase the fertilizer application rates at all. All we did was look at the timing of that application and made sure that the timing was aligned with crop uptake, and yield increased 34 bushels. Great economic benefit to the farmer. Nitrogen use efficiency. In the control, we were producing a bushel of corn on 0.94 pounds of nitrogen. In the split, we're producing a bushel of corn with 0.79 pounds of nitrogen. It's a 16% increase in nitrogen use efficiency. So that's a pretty fun number to see. If there's one thing that our stakeholders want from our 4R Alliance is economic numbers on best management practices that farmers are doing. So here's a little bit of information for you on the economics on this particular site, right? If we use the economic assumptions that the November 2021 corn price in Adams County was $6.08 a bushel, and they were able to purchase liquid nitrogen in June for around $370 a ton, here's what the economics work out to. When we go from all of our nitrogen up front to adopting a split application, you'll notice that our fertilizer costs go up because it costs us something to drive that equipment across the field one more time. But our per unit fertilizer costs go down, right? And when we're putting all of our nitrogen on up front, our per unit fertilizer cost was 50 cents a bushel. When we adopt that split, even though we're incurring additional costs, we're getting a pretty sizable return on that investment, and our per unit fertilizer costs go down. So we got an 18% increase in revenue. You think about 4Rs and you think about the economics, the environmental and the social aspects of 4Rs, there's your economic return, right? 18% increase in revenue going to that farm. That's a pretty significant return on investment, and a 6% decrease in fertilizer costs. Also a pretty significant outcome for farms that are adopting split applications. So one of the things that I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about is phosphorus impacts on a nitrogen practice, right? We're talking about increasing nitrogen use efficiency and having farmers split apply their nitrogen, and it's leading to a yield increase, right? We've got almost 19 bushels of yield increase from our Maryland cooperators. We've got 17 bushels of yield increase from our Pennsylvania cooperators. If you looked at that 17 bushel increase in Pennsylvania, you start doing some pretty simple math, that increased phosphorus removal by an average of 8.8 pounds per acre. We didn't apply any other phosphorus. All we did was look at the timing of our nitrogen applications, and it increases phosphorus removal because it increases yield. So if you looked at the total 3,595 acres that we had enrolled in this project in year one, split applying their nitrogen removed an additional 28,200 pounds of phosphorus. That's a pretty astounding number, right? You start taking that 8.8 pounds of additional phosphorus removal, and you start multiplying that by the number of acres of corn that are grown in both Pennsylvania and Maryland and Delaware, the ability of a nitrogen practice or an agronomic BMP to influence not only nitrogen removal, but phosphorus removal is a pretty cool thing. So keep that in mind as you're working with your customers and as you're advising farmers on 4R practices, that there is a ripple effect in terms of how one practice can have a benefit in something else. So I definitely want this audience in particular to understand that agronomic BMPs can move the needle on water quality. You know, split applications of nitrogen, farmers are doing it pretty much for economic returns, right? They know that if they split apply their nitrogen, they're going to get an economic bump, increased yields, increased revenues, but there's a water quality perspective of that too, right? It's increasing the yield, it's improving the nitrogen use efficiency. If it's doing both of those things, it's reducing nitrogen loss. Right? If you're applying a pound of nitrogen to your corn crop, we want to make sure that that pound returns yield to you, not gets lost into the surface water or wherever else it's going. But by using a split application, we're reducing the overall nitrogen loss on that field. We're also increasing P removal, which can improve or reduce P loss. So we should be shouting this from the rooftops as CCAs, as trusted advisors on farms, as nutrient management plan writers, as people working as conservation professionals and conservation districts and NRCS and any other regulatory role that they play. Like, we want to be advocating for more agronomic BMPs on the landscape, because these are the benefits of them. We're going to see better use efficiency from our nitrogen and phosphorus and less loss into the environment. So we in the Pennsylvania 4R Alliance work very diligently to make sure that we have a consistent message across our stakeholders. That if a CCA is talking about split applications and a conservation district employee is talking about split applications and DEP and EPA are talking about split applications, that everybody understands what the economic and environmental outcomes of that practice are. So I would encourage all of you in your conversations with farmers and your conversations with your peers, make sure that we're talking about this, how agronomic practices can move the needle on water quality, because there's other practices out there that can do the same thing. I do think we need to talk about, why we see the success of split applications and how it's going to vary from farm to farm, because even in our Adams County cooperators, some of our farmers only had a 3 bushel increase and some of our farmers had a 34 bushel increase. And you're going to see that very wide range of response to any practice that you employ on a farm. And in particular, when you think about split applications, the success of that BMP on a field is really going to depend on this list of things. The soil's ability to hold nitrogen, how much sand, silt, clay, and organic matter does that field have, is going to be very much related to how much nitrogen that particular soil can hold. The active loss pathways in that field, nitrogen gets lost from a field, whether it's from volatilization or leaching or denitrification or immobilization, surface runoff. And we want to make sure that whatever loss pathway is most active in that field, that we're addressing it. Weather is going to influence how successful we are with split applications, starting with an accurate rate. Okay, that starts with knowing what your yield goal is for your particular soil and making sure that we're not over fertilizing for that yield goal, and just making sure we have realistic yield goals in place. Fertilizer sources, farm logistics, equipment, adaptive management, you get the point. I never want people to feel like they're going to go into a split application and my nutrient management plan tells me I can apply 100 pounds. I don't ever want people to feel like, at least in Pennsylvania, that they are 100% beholden to that 100 pounds, because there are adaptive management strategies that you can do in season, whether it's a PSNT, whether it's nitrogen modeling, whether it's plant sampling, using a green seeker, or using any other kind of NDVI sensor that you have, that will allow you to adjust fertilizer rates in season off of what your nutrient management plan would say. And I would say that's needed for successful implementation of split applications. We want to make sure that there's enough nitrogen there to support whatever yield you can get from that field. And yes, it takes all of these planning tools, but it also takes us getting out into the field and figuring out what kind of site-specific things are going on that we need to address and react to, and be a little adaptive in terms of our management. So that's my story for today. I'm thankful for the opportunity to talk with you all. And I'll be around here for most of the morning. If you have any questions, please let me know. So Janelle, I'll turn it back to you.
Hey, Eric, this is Lindsay. So thank you so much. That was really informative and exciting to see those results. We did have a couple of questions. So Mike Twining with Willard Agri-Service was asking, specific to the Adams County example that you gave, do you know if they applied the same amount of total sulfur in the pre-emerge application in both splits?
I'm going to say no. The one example that I had showed you where they had put 130 pounds of nitrogen on pre-emerge versus doing a split of 65 and 65, the split would have had more sulfur because that dry blend would have had a higher sulfur concentration.
Okay. And then Amy was asking about estimating the reduction in N2O emissions and potential loss of and remaining in the field between, you know, going from all pre-emerge application, what's the N2O loss there versus splitting it up in order to show additional environmental benefits. So that's definitely something that we can consider moving forward, trying to figure out how to calculate that.
Yeah, we did not focus at all on that type of loss.
All right, we do have another few minutes here in Eric's presentation time. Did anybody have any additional questions they'd like to ask before we move on? Feel free to either raise your hand or take yourself off mute.
I'll just add a comment. I think this is exciting, and I'm excited once we get the results of the farmer survey that Kelly Davidson's leading. We should have a better idea of how much the opportunity is to increase splits, you know, across farms, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia. So that might give us some good guidance of kind of where we can go with this. And I don't know, Eric, if you have any sense just from, you know, your current work, if you think like there's a lot of opportunity so for farmers to still do split N, or, you know, are a lot already doing this?
There's a lot of, I think the split applications of nitrogen are probably one of the more common practices that farmers are doing. There's still a lot of opportunity though to increase the amount of splits. And I guess I can only speak for my little corner of Pennsylvania that I deal in, but there's a lot more interest this year in late season applications with a Y drop type of application in the southern part of the state. Up north, once you get up above Williamsport, we still struggle with doing a single split application simply because of you know, the amount of equipment that is in that neck of the woods and just some of the farm logistics. So I think in Pennsylvania, we have a very different opportunities for split applications depending on what region of the state we're in.
And Eric, are most farmers that you're working with, are they doing it themselves, or are they hiring kind of custom applicators to do it?
Majority are doing the first split themselves. And I would also say that those that are looking at doing a later split when the corn is, you know, over 6 feet tall, most of them are having somebody come in to do that application for them.
All right. Thanks so much, Eric. Appreciate it. So we're going to go ahead and move on. I will give a brief update here on the 2020 National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant that the Mid-Atlantic for our Nutrient Stewardship Association has with components in both Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on the Split Nitrogen 2022. Eric did a great job of covering that. But we do have cost share available for the 2022 growing season. That is $15 per acre with some data reporting and collection requirements. If you are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed portion of Maryland, Delaware, or Pennsylvania, if you're in Maryland and Delaware, please reach out to Janelle if you are interested in signing up or have cooperators that you think would be a good fit for this program. And Janelle can add her email there in the chat. And for Pennsylvania, please reach out to Eric for the split nitrogen opportunity there. The next thing that I'm going to share with you here is another component of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant that we have. And that would be our benchmarking and assessment tool. So can you guys see my screen there with the benchmarking and assessment tool? All right. So the primary contact on this is Brian with the Nature Conservancy, Brian Campbell, and he is located up in Pennsylvania. And so this tool is to be used by advisors and farmers to evaluate your current level of implementation of the 4 Rs, and then have that be a conversation with your nutrient management planner, your technical service provider, your consultants on, okay, here's where I am, and here's where the next step of implementation along the 4R continuum would be. And so here on the first page, you'll see a lot of additional resources, which are really helpful. So you have decision tools from the universities, as well as the International Plant Nutrition Institute, financial and technical assistance opportunities in all of the states, as well as the federal level, for our nutrient stewardship resources, as well as the state regulations for nutrient management in each of the 3 states. And as you move along here, there's questions about general management. So do you have a nutrient management plan? Do you follow those recommendations? Are you soil testing? How often are you soil testing? So it's pretty comprehensive here. Asking about timing of nitrogen application, your rate, if you are using manure, the sources, the timing, and the application rate there, things specific to phosphorus management as well. And so I didn't fill out the answers there, so we do not have an example output. But again, if any of the consultants or service providers on the phone here or on the call today are interested in that, we can certainly share the link to be able to utilize that benchmarking and assessment tool. The other thing that I'm going to share with you, Amy mentioned it briefly, is our barriers survey that we're really excited about. So Kelly Davidson with the University of Delaware is the primary investigator on this portion of the project. But we're essentially looking at, how do farmers make their nutrient management decisions? What 4R practices are they currently implementing? And then what are the barriers to them moving along that 4R continuum? And so the survey was developed through a series of focus groups in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania with farmers, as well as some phone interviews with both consultants and technical service providers, as well as farmers, and asks a variety of questions, just baseline information about the farm, how many acres, what do you grow, do you have livestock, and then gets into these more complex decision tables about current implementation, and then also, what do you value most? Are you looking at crop yields, input costs, time, soil health, environmental quality, some questions about modeling tools, and then also gets into questions about barriers here. So are you having a hard time finding the right information? Do you not have the right equipment? Do you not have the technical assistance that's required? Is leased land an issue for implementing 4R practices? And then who are your trusted advisors? How influential are each of these categories of advisors? And then what would be most helpful as far as information on implementing 4R practices and how do you want to receive that information. And so this survey was sent out to a representative sample of farmers and applicators in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Kelly has those results back, and we are expecting preliminary results this spring that will be used for a communication summit that we're having for the steering committees for us to develop our communications strategy moving forward for the implementation period of the NIFWIF project and beyond. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is some outreach events that we're planning. So be on the lookout for some field day events in Pennsylvania, as well as Maryland, Delaware this summer and into the fall. And we're also planning to utilize the results of that communication strategy summit to develop some 4R real talks. Those are going to be hosted on farm with a farmer and their advisor to talk about specific 4R practice implementation and how that has gone for that farmer and advisor pair, as well as some train the trainer programs as well. So that is what I have as far as the NIFWIF grant update. Does anybody have any questions before we move on? All right, again, if you're interested in the split nitrogen application cost share opportunity, please reach out to either Janelle or Eric, depending on where you are located. There is still definitely time to sign up for this spring application period. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Amy to talk to us about a Chesapeake Bay Trust grant opportunity that we have as well.
There we go.
All right, we're seeing the presenter view. Amy, if you want to swap your display settings.
Yes, thank you. Okay, does that look good? All right, so as Lindsay mentioned, we have another grant with the 4R Alliance where we were piloting a project to provide a $1,000 voucher to farmers to assist them to work with an agribusiness to analyze data and create a plan for what their next steps kind of on their 4R journey would be and what practices they would want to implement by taking a deeper dive into the data from their farm. So we piloted this in Harford County and Cecil County. We had a field day this past summer where we brought farmers together, talked about the program, and we had several agribusinesses that participated to talk about kind of what the options were for doing more advanced practices. And the voucher program, we're getting good reception. We have 15 vouchers available for farmers to work with, and we have 2 remaining. So if you know of farmers that you're working with, or you are a farmer that is interested in this in Harford and Cecil County, please reach out to us. You can reach out to me and I can connect you with the process. We're trying to keep it as simple as possible. And it's just letting us know that you're interested in enrolling in the program. And then we sign you up and you receive the services from your trusted advisor that you're working with. And then you just need to submit documentation and a W-9 of the plan that was developed. And we provide the $1,000 voucher to the farmer to be able to pay the advisor that they worked with. And then we also have opportunities through some other NRCS funding for potential cost share to implement those practices. So we will be doing a follow-up interview with the farmers that participated to understand the value of the program and to see if we want to expand this into other areas. And I think we'll also be able to get a sense of the practices that are being implemented and if there's any needs there that we could assist with to support that those are followed through to implementation. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. And this is also available on our website as well.
All right. Okay, thanks, Amy. While we have a few minutes, I do also want to draw your attention to one additional opportunity for cost share that's available through the Maryland Department of Agriculture, also working with a NIFWIF grant on soil health. So there are opportunities available for implementation of precision nutrient management, some prescribed grazing, as well as multi-species cover crop and reducing your tillage. If you are interested in more information about that, the timing on that is coming to a little bit of a close here. They do need to get some pre-nutrient application soil tests. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to myself or Janelle, and we will get you connected with Kevin at the Maryland Department of Agriculture. At this time, we're going to take about a 5-minute break. All right, everyone, welcome back. Let's make sure that we have a critical mass of everybody back here. Those that are back on, if you want to give a quick thumbs up on the screen so that we know that we have everybody back. Awesome. Okay, seeing lots of thumbs up. So Amy, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to you. So Amy Schober is joining us from the University of Delaware to talk to us about barriers to access and use of poultry litter. Again, a reminder, if you have a question throughout the presentation, please feel free to enter that into the chat or raise your hand, and we will recognize you for questions at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'll go ahead and get started. Before I start, though, I do want to thank my co-authors, Leah Palm-Forster and Rachel King from the University of Delaware and Mark Ryder from Virginia Tech. I'm going to talk a little bit about some social science work that we've done as a part of a larger AFRI USDA grant and with Project Wicked through NSF at the University of Delaware. I know a lot of you probably are familiar with the broiler industry on Delmarva, but for those of you who might live across the bay, I thought I'd give a really brief introduction to the situation. So if we're looking at production of broilers on Delmarva in 2020, our growers produced about 570 million birds. And if you look at that compared to the population of the Delmarva Peninsula, it equates to roughly 400 chickens per person living in the region. The map here is showing the distribution of poultry houses on the peninsula, and poultry litter that is generated in production is an important source for our farmers to get nutrients for their locally grown corn and soybean crops, which are then used to feed the broilers. So it's a pretty circular industry. Birds produced on the peninsula, though, consistently are consuming more corn and soybean than we can produce regionally every year. This means that every year we are bringing additional grain into the region. This importing of the grain and the land application of manure has resulted in a long-term trend for significant regional phosphorus imbalances. This is because the corn and soybean contain phosphorus, which is then excreted in manure that remains on the peninsula. So our current and historical application of poultry litter to agricultural soils, especially when we're close to those high intensity areas of poultry operations, has ultimately led to this buildup of soil test phosphorus to levels that are exceeding our agronomic needs. If you look on the map here, I'm showing the balance. Those counties that are highlighted in green have the highest surpluses. These legacy phosphorus sources have also resulted in losses that impact water quality because our soils tend to have a low nutrient holding capacity and a seasonal high water table. And in some areas, we have extensive drainage systems that allow agricultural production, but also act as direct conduits for nutrients to leave the landscape and enter sensitive water bodies like the Chesapeake Bay. But even though we see these large surpluses in some counties, we still have a lot of areas which are shown in these orangey and yellow colors where there's actually a phosphorus deficit, and crops could benefit from phosphorus in the poultry litter. Because of this phosphorus imbalance too, there's been a large focus on alternative uses for poultry litter, particularly in those counties which have the highest phosphorus surpluses. So examples of this were efforts to pelletize or compost litter for use in alternative markets like the lawn and landscape industry. Litter is also being moved into southeastern Pennsylvania each year, and it becomes an ingredient in mushroom substrate. Plus, there's been a lot of interest in turning manure into energy through incineration or anaerobic digestion. But most of these efforts, except for the export to the mushroom industry, haven't really significantly reduced the amount of litter that's land applied in the region. And the Purdue pelletizing plant was closed after 16 years of operation, largely because the venture failed to turn a profit. As an agronomist, I think land application is still the preferred use for poultry litter in our region because the litter provides our farmers with a source of organic matter, nitrogen, sulfur, and micronutrients, all which would have to be applied to soils from other sources if we didn't have litter. And in years where the fertilizer prices are the way they are, our farmers really appreciate the nitrogen and other nutrients that they can get from the poultry litter. We've actually been able to show that even when you apply manures to high phosphorus soils, we can get those benefits of manure and still draw that soil test P down if we manage our manure in a way that allows for some kind of deficit in crop removal. So even our farmers who are dealing with high concentrations of phosphorus in their soils can still get access to the organic matter, the nitrogen, and the micros that they would desperately need for their low fertility soils. We have state-run programs in place designed to distribute and use litter in a more efficient manner. For example, cost share is available for litter transport and storage. Researchers have also participated in research to build equipment like the litter injector, which will hopefully allow us to apply solid litter below the soil surface, much like we're doing with the liquid dairy and dairy manures in our pasture systems in the western side of Maryland and in Pennsylvania. But despite all of these available resources, we're still facing huge challenges with respect to litter distribution and management. For example, the map on this slide is showing movement of litter through the Delaware Manure Transport Cost Share Program. And this is just data showing you for one individual year. The dots are the zip code centroids showing the origination areas of the manure. And then the lines are showing where that manure has been transported to. Interestingly, this map shows that some movement is happening out of state into areas of Maryland and New Jersey for land application. And it highlights too that movement to southeastern Pennsylvania for use in the mushroom industry. But there's still a lot of transfer within the state and within areas that have significant phosphorus surpluses. It's also apparent that Delaware litter isn't really moving south into Virginia or into areas of Maryland that might benefit from receiving manure. And Another thing though, is this data really only represents transport from Delaware, but it does highlight some of the regional challenges that we face. Our research question based on all of this was, what is stopping us from more efficient litter distribution and use on the Delmarva Peninsula? To answer this question, we secured some funding to ask the agricultural community to identify their barriers to the more efficient distribution and use of litter. We interviewed local manure brokers in fall of 2019, and we deployed 2 surveys in summer of 2020. One was to Delmarva poultry growers and another was to grain crop producers. The grain crop producer survey actually had a larger geographic focus and included farmers in Pennsylvania and the western areas of Maryland and into Virginia, because we partnered with another research group who had some funding to look at user preferences and information about poultry litter ash and ash co-products. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus on the results of the crop producer survey. So what we found was that, oh, I'm sorry, I should mention that we contracted with NASS to deliver this survey, and it went to farmers growing grain crops in Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. We had 462 responses, mostly from Delmarva, and I'm going to go back here so you can see the map. Anywhere where we have highlighted in green is where we have some responses, and the darker the color of green, the more responses we had. And interestingly, while we were targeting within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we did manage to get some farmers out in Western Pennsylvania that answered our survey. What we found was only 19% of our survey respondents stated that they currently use poultry litter. And 38% of the respondents who didn't already use that poultry litter expressed interest in using it, but they currently don't because they are facing barriers to getting that or using that manure. We weren't surprised that 35% of the farmers answering the survey said that they couldn't access poultry litter either at all or during times of the year when they would need to apply it as fertilizer. Plus another 25% said they didn't know if litter was available in their area. We know that there's a seasonality to poultry litter use. Most of our regional farmers are applying litter right about now to annual grain crops rather than in perennial systems like you would see out in the western parts of Pennsylvania and Maryland. Our hot time for litter is right now in the late winter to early spring prior to corn planting. But not all of that litter is going to be available and removed from the poultry houses during this time. Instead, our litter cleanouts are happening all year long, and the timing and frequency of those cleanouts is highly variable. For example, some of our poultry growers may wait up to a decade or longer before they have a whole house clean out. Now, that doesn't mean that litter is not coming out of their house, but it's not the entire volume of litter being removed at one time. We have results from our poultry grower survey that corroborate why we hear complaints about the inability to find litter, even from grain farmers who live within those high density areas of poultry production. And then it's not surprising too that that availability only decreases more and more the farther that farmer is from those areas of high density poultry production. So the take home message on this is that there's not always a lot of poultry litter available during times that farmers want to use it as fertilizer. And this is kind of counter to the argument that we have excess poultry litter in the region. Crop farmers that we surveyed also expressed a lack of knowledge about how to properly store poultry litter on their operation, with about 28% saying they don't know how to store the litter, and another 31% saying they don't know if they don't know how to store litter. So we'll take that as we don't know. Because our grain farmers are often operating separately from the poultry operations, most of the grain farmers lack access to covered manure storage sheds. This leaves field staging as the main storage before it can be spread. And each of our states on the peninsula has regulatory setbacks and timing allowances for that field staging practice. When we talk about neighbor relations and regulatory concerns, about half of the farmers we surveyed expressed concerns related to neighbor relations, mainly due to odor complaints. Odor complaints are common during the poultry litter storage and application season. We know that people tend to smell with their eyes, and when they start to see the manure being spread, the smells are there, and it's just ever so much more noticeable. Not to mention that farmers in our region may fear that poultry litter use might open them up to lawsuits if people think that they're using another kind of organic amendment. We weren't also surprised that half the farmers who responded expressed concerns related to environmental regulations. This could include setbacks, blackout dates, or restrictions on application to soils with high soil test phosphorus concentration. But we know that farmers in the Chesapeake Bay states are really no stranger to those environmental regulations. The last barrier I want to touch on, though, is the equipment or a lack thereof, as 51% of our respondents indicated that they lacked the proper equipment needed to apply poultry litter, and another 19% said they didn't know how to answer the question. We didn't ask about specific equipment, but it could include spreaders, loaders, bucket tractors, etc. And we know that growers may be unwilling or unable to invest in equipment to use poultry litter, especially if they have problems related to litter storage or access. Despite all those barriers, though, we still believe that there are many opportunities to improve litter distribution and use on the Delmarva Peninsula, but we recognize that there's really no silver bullet, and that one size fits all approaches are likely to be unrealistic or ineffective. But we do provide several actions that we believe we could take regionally to improve nutrient balance. Many of the poultry litter transactions occur between private parties, and unlike dairies that often have animals and land, our poultry and grain operations are typically decoupled. Both the poultry farmers and the grain farmers indicated that they lack the appropriate connections that are needed to buy and sell litter efficiently. Therefore, there's a clear need to facilitate those connections, and development of regional manure clearinghouses like the Litter Phone app that was recently launched by the Delmarva Chicken Association, or a web-based platform that was developed by a University of Delaware team of student entrepreneurs. These types of tools can help to connect buyers, sellers, and service providers, but they only work if they're widely accessible and people actively use them. There might be technology barriers related to those types of tools. Our state-run manure transport cost share programs are already operating in Delaware, Maryland, and in Virginia, but in many cases, these programs, so these programs are a large investment by the states to facilitate transport of litter. In Maryland, as an example, they spent $1.4 million to support manure transport in 2020. But we saw with that Delaware example that many transfers are still happening within a relatively small geographic region. And we feel there's room to consider aligning or potentially regionalizing those transport programs to increase efficiency. Improving the litter storage can also have a huge impact on improving access and distribution of the litter for farmers who wish to land apply further away from those areas of intensive poultry production. Maryland has recently announced that they have cost share available to build covered manure storage on grain farms that receive poultry litter. However, they are offering this at a lower rate than would be offered to poultry growers who are looking to build on-farm covered manure storage. Manure storage cost share will help, but we also could consider the construction of regional holding facilities. Another place that we could really improve access is by increasing proper field staging. Currently, Maryland growers are allowed to field stage for an undetermined period if the litter is going to be applied in the following spring. Delaware growers are given 120 days to field stage unless they are a CAFO. And Delaware growers can actually increase that time frame for field staging on a case-by-case basis if they contact the Delaware Department of Agriculture and schedule a farm visit that confirms proper litter storage. Proper staging means following all of the regulatory setbacks from houses, roads, and water bodies, and maintaining a 6-foot-high conical pile. Following those guidelines greatly reduces complaints related to field staging, including odor. And it also keeps our nutrient losses to a minimum. Virginia still requires covering a litter pile with an impermeable wind-resistant cover. Otherwise, the pile needs to be spread within 14 days. But Delaware and Maryland moved away from requiring covers about a decade ago when Greg Binford's work from the University of Delaware showed that those properly peaked piles form a crust like you see in this picture here. And that crust allows rainwater to shed without causing excessive nutrient losses. And the nutrient losses from these uncovered piles were actually no different statistically than the nutrient losses when compared to covered piles. Therefore, we think education and workshops on field staging should be prioritized so that we can allow for more people to access manure outside that hot time when people want to spread it. Our final recommendation is to evaluate measures to facilitate access to equipment. This could be in the form of cost share for new litter users or through expansion of custom applicator services or equipment sharing. In fact, I know that the Queen Anne's County Conservation District has a manure spreader that they do rent out, and I believe that it is 100% rented for the season. One thing about these other options, though, like the custom applicator services and the equipment sharing, is we have to be concerned with other barriers like potential biosecurity issues with equipment moving between poultry farms. And that is a pretty hot topic right now, considering the AI outbreaks that we're having within the region. So just to summarize, we still have a lot more data to crunch from these surveys, but we do feel strongly that we are hoping to promote responsible litter management because it supports crop production and yield goals and protects our water quality within the region. We know that accessing poultry litter can be an issue, and that beyond access, our farmers are facing additional barriers to using poultry litter related to equipment or storage. And not all of it is lack of knowledge. A lot of it is lack of resources. And finally, we believe that we should be focusing our programs and policies to support access and responsible transport, storage, and use of poultry litter within the region. With that, I'd like to thank my funding agencies and just provide my contact information for anyone who might have questions related to this particular study.
Thanks, Amy.
You're welcome.
Very interesting and helpful. Given the timing of the survey work, you may have missed kind of the window that I'm particularly curious about. But was there any expression from farmers that they were either more interested in utilizing poultry litter, or if they had never used poultry litter before, that they were now interested in poultry litter because of the price and availability of commercial fertilizer?
Yeah, unfortunately, you're correct. We put this survey out in 2020 as the fertilizer prices were starting to go up, but they were nowhere near what they are right now. And it seems like this is kind of the theme in research is, you know, you do something with good intentions. I think that we would see an increase in people who are interested in using poultry litter. Another thing we need to still do is we're trying to tease out a little bit some of those kind of outlying responses from Western Pennsylvania. I imagine a lot of them maybe don't have interest in using poultry litter because I don't really know how many poultry growers you have in the northwestern part of Pennsylvania. But Rachel King is doing a lot more work with this data set, and we hope to have additional information available in the next couple months.
Well, I'll say that I hope it's a temporary issue that we ultimately don't need an answer to. When Eric quoted the price of nitrogen for last year, I was like, oh my gosh. Kind of painful to hear right now.
I
So,
haven't looked in a couple of days, but I imagine that our next speaker is maybe going to talk a little bit about that right now.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions or comments for Amy? Okay. All right. With that, Jason, are you with us and ready to get started on your presentation?
Good morning. I am, if that works. Yep.
Absolutely. I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your slides whenever you're ready to get started.
Yeah, well, first of all, just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be able to be with you all today. Just as a quick way of introduction, my name is Jason Trundle. I'm with the Fertilizer Institute. So per the comments, yes, I am going to talk a little bit about fertilizer price and just kind of some of the different things that are going on. I've been with TFI for about a year or so. I have a background in agricultural economics. I'm a rural farm kid from southeastern Minnesota, and I and my wife now actually live in Rockville, Maryland, and she's going back to school at the University of Maryland. So appreciate the time today. Can you see these slides?
Yes, we can. Looks
Perfect.
good.
Okay, great. So my intent is just to walk through some general information on kind of some of the factors that are going on in the fertilizer space, but would love to leave a little bit of time at the end to help answer some questions. So unfortunately, can't go through absolutely everything in super detail, but will do the best I can with the time we have. So first, just kind of top of mind, in addition to price, is obviously the impact of Russia. And so as we look at Russia and everything that's happening with their invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions, we feel like Russia is obviously going to impact the fertilizer market in two ways. One, first, Russia is a very large producer of fertilizer product. As you can see, 23% of ammonia, 14% of urea, 10% of phosphates, and 21% of the global potash export market. So in terms of absolute availability of fertilizer, that's going to be an issue. And something to note with these sanctions, as well as other sanctions that many of you are probably aware of, but just because, Brazil has not sanctioned, or India has not sanctioned Russia, does not mean that they can necessarily purchase product. And that's primarily because many of these transactions happen in US dollars, and they happen through banks that are unwilling to touch these transactions because of those sanctions. So that's really, kind of the first impact. And specifically for the United States, we don't get a ton of our nitrogen products from Russia, but we do get about 8% of our potash from Russia, and about another 4 to 5% is from Belarus, who we also have sanctions on. So when you think about our potash, we primarily import a majority of our potash because unfortunately we don't have potash or the rock or the mineral here. So there's going to be, that 12 to 13% of potash that we're going to have to get from someplace else. So that's the first impact. The second impact really is around energy. So natural gas is the building block for all of our nitrogen fertilizers, and Russia is a gas station for the world, both in terms of crude as well as natural gas. So depending on how all those flows happen, we would anticipate an impact there, particularly on the cost side of production. So just wanted to highlight that real briefly, obviously as a key top issue. As you alluded to, here this is Corn Belt or Midwest, I should say, ammonia. It's near that $1,400 a ton mark at this point. And so there's been a lot that's been happening over the last 18 months that have kind of led us to this point. I think one of the challenges is I went home for Christmas, and I feel like each Christmas I get a different question. The first one was, when are you going to get married? When I was in college, what's your first job going to be? This year, when I went home for Christmas, I was nervous because all my uncles are farmers, and the question was going to be, Jason, what the heck is going on with fertilizer prices? And I think the challenge is, as an economist and as a little bit of a data nerd, it's hard to pick one reason because there's been such a multitude of factors that have really gone into this. And that's what makes it challenging to, kind of explain in a really short period of time. So I'm going to touch on a couple of these buckets that you see up here on the screen today. So as we think about that and thinking back to Russia, one thing that's really important to note is fertilizer is an incredibly global market. So even though here in the United States, we're a very large ag producer, we only consume about 10% of the total nutrients related to fertilizer. 90% happens outside the United States. So that means that when things occur in other places of the world, it's going to impact what's going on here in the US. Just to put that in perspective, corn, wheat, soy, and cotton, are globally traded. About 23% of all product leaves the country that it was grown in to someplace else. For fertilizer, it's twice as much. 44% of all fertilizer is exported. So we are subject to, and US farmers are subject to, global factors and a global price. So talking about just specific things that have led up to where we are today. So obviously, we're still in it, but the global pandemic really impacted the fertilizer markets really in two ways. The first side was just kind of around production planning. So as you can see, there's an organization that came out, the International Fertilizer Association came out with a estimate at the end of 2019 that fertilizer demand was going to slowly increase in 2020, 2021. Once COVID hit, they came out with a revised forecast that significantly reduced where they thought demand was going, just because, to the point of it being a highly globally traded market, they were concerned about exports of fertilizer being able to get out of the country logistically, which decreased this forecast. So as a producer of fertilizer going into the start of the pandemic, demand doesn't look super strong. And at the same time of that, we also had the World Bank, who came out. We had seen up until this point, 7 quarters of decline around price. So the fertilizer price index, and it was projected to fall by an additional 10% during this time. So as a producer of fertilizer, demand doesn't look great, prices don't look great. So I'm not going crazy on my fertilizer production. So coming into the pandemic, we weren't probably going, all out on what was going on there. The second thing that impacted the way COVID impacted this was turnarounds. So these large ammonia plants that produce our nitrogen fertilizers, every 3 to 4 years, they shut down for 2 to 6 weeks to undergo necessary maintenance. So that means in an average year, a quarter to a third of all the plants or facilities would be shut down. In COVID, we didn't know, particularly on the onset, how it was spread. And so companies deferred maintenance so that way they wouldn't have to bring additional contractors onto site to potentially spread COVID. And so they pushed all of the maintenance that they could until 2021. So all of a sudden, when we needed to be running full steam in 2021, we had all these plants that had to undergo these shutdowns. In a typical year, we would see 7 or 8 facilities that were shut down. In the summer of 2021, we saw 13 facilities that were shut down during that period. And each one of those shutdowns impacts the ability, supply or disrupts supply because those facilities are offline for a period of time. So COVID impacted us in terms of it wasn't a great outlook. And we had to then all of a sudden all shut down in 2021 in order to do this maintenance. In addition, in 2021, we saw some really significant weather events. So as you were all aware, in February, there was a huge ice storm that came through kind of the Texas, Oklahoma area. Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana account for 60% of our ammonia production in the United States. So we collect production data at TFI from our members who are producers as well as retailers all over. But just from that storm, we lost 305,000 short tons of N. So this isn't of ammonia, this isn't of urea, this is of N. Just to put that in perspective, that represents about a little over 2% of our annual production. So this winter storm took away a little over 2% of our annual production just from that. In addition, we had another hit on top of that at the end of September or end of August, beginning of September. Hurricane Ida came through and additionally knocked off some production, both for ammonia, but as well as for phosphate based on where it hit. So in 2021, we had more turnarounds than what we initially anticipated. So there was more supply that was offline. We had supply offline because of all these hurricanes. And at the same time, we also saw an increase in production cost. So speaking of natural gas is really important for ammonia production, and it can make up anywhere between about 70 and 90% of the cost to produce ammonia. So here's just that kind of quick chart. Historically, we can really see the importance of natural gas cost. So this chart is a little bit busy, but what it's showing is the boxes along the bottom are the number of companies that were producing or are producing ammonia in the United States. The blue bars represent the number of plants or facilities that we have, and the red bar is the natural gas price. So as you can see, between about 99 through about 2008, we had steadily increasing natural gas prices here in the United States. What that meant was facilities over time slowly started to shut down because they could no longer compete with in the global market because there was cheaper natural gas in other locations, Russia, various places around the world. So we saw a slow decrease in domestic production. All of a sudden in 2008, we had the shale gas revolution and natural gas prices there you can see came down. And what happened? More companies. So compared to a decade ago, we actually have more companies who are producing ammonia, and we have more plants, all the way back up to 35 plants from a low of 22, 16 companies from a low of 12. So natural gas has a really important relationship here. Additionally, the good news is, even though we haven't gotten back to that 42 plants, the plants that we do have gotten upgraded or are larger, and we actually are producing the same quantity of ammonia that we had historically. So this also kind of goes to the question of, is the domestic industry, particularly on the ammonia side, competitive, and how has that changed over time? Well, compared to a decade ago, we have more plants and we have more companies. And when you think of this from a global scale, we probably are the most competitive market, maybe China, but China, a lot of those are government owned in terms of the number of facilities and number of companies. India, they have a lot of facilities, but they're a little bit smaller. But a majority of countries in the world that produce ammonia, they have one, maybe two companies, one, maybe two facilities. And so we have a lot of companies in a lot of facilities, which is helpful during a time like this. So we have robust domestic production. And so we are the third largest producer in the upper left. You can see there of ammonia as well as urea. And we're blessed with phosphate reserves. So we're actually the third largest producer of phosphates as well. As I stated earlier, unfortunately, we don't have potash in the country. It's just not a mineral deposit that we have, so we import a majority of our potash. So, we're a large producer of nitrogen, but during this time period, we saw natural gas prices here increase. They doubled between March and November of last year. And there you can see we've stayed relatively high. And even today, they're close to double or higher than where they were this time last year. So the cost of production has increased. When we think about it from a global perspective, in Europe, it's been a lot worse. So we saw it hit a high. This is dollars per MMBTU back in December at the end of last year. That was subsequently beat. I think it was last week or the week before, but every $1 increase in the cost of natural gas adds $32 for a ton of ammonia. So to put this in perspective, we increased from $5 to about $5 to about $60, which is about $55 increase. So you take 55 times 32, you're looking at the additional cost of production, not counting what it was at $5, went up $1,500 during this time period in Europe. So in Europe, we saw about 40% of all the facilities shut down or shuttered because they just simply, the cost of production was much higher than what the market could pay for in terms of ammonia. So to put this in perspective for growers, for farmers, so what has this meant? In June of 2020, so when we think about it in terms of a ton of DAP, which includes both phosphate as well as nitrogen, the cost of production for a non-integrated producer would have been $195 in June of 2020. At the end of February, the cost to produce that same ton was $650. So, the cost tripled during this time period. So we had the impacts from COVID, we had the weather impacts, we also had significant increase in the cost of production. Lastly, on the supply side, we've had a ton of trade disruptions that have happened during this 18-month period, just adding to this perfect storm. So first, as you probably are aware, we had the trade case against phosphates. So we saw over here at the halfway through 2020, our imports significantly decreased because we were no longer able to, or it was no longer economically feasible to import from Russia and Morocco. The good news is that was a temporary disruption, and actually in 2021 we actually have we've surpassed the average between 15 and 19. We're up about 11% in terms of imports, and those have been replaced by other countries that you see listed here on the screen. So it was definitely a temporary disruption, certainly, but luckily we've been able to supply imports from other countries. Similarly, we've had a trade case that's still actually under kind of in process with the ITC and ITA on UAN from Russia and Trinidad. So, over the past 5 years, Trinidad or Russia has accounted for about 23%, and Trinidad's about 45% of our UAN. Canada is about 17%. And so, we are going to have to find a way to potentially replace that. The good news on the upper left there you see is we have robust domestic production, almost 15.5 million tons of US production, and we import imports really only they account for about 16% or so of our domestic kind of use here in the US. So going to be probably some disruption, but again, luckily, hopefully, because we have domestic supply, that's helpful. Other things that have, so that was kind of on the nitrogen phosphate side. Additionally, on the potash side, back in September, we sanctioned Belarus because of some of the actions of their dictator. Belarus makes up 21% of the global potash market. So for those of you who are keeping math, between Russia's 21% and Belarus is 21%. Right now, we've sanctioned and kind of shut off about 42% or so of the global market, which is going to have significant ramifications on the price. Again, luckily, we get a majority of ours from Canada, so hopefully we will be able to secure the supply. The challenge will be it'll be at probably a much significant or higher price. Additionally, back in September, at beginning of October, China. And I've highlighted this box for an important reason. I think there's going to be a question about this, but China represents 25% of the global phosphate, the global phosphate export market. So they shut off all of their exports at September, first on the phosphates, and then in October, they followed it up with nitrogen materials. So this is, again, really significant. All of a sudden, you take 25% of phosphates off the global market, that's going to put upward pressure on price. So keep in mind, again, China accounts for 25% of the global phosphate market. Additionally, at that point in time in November, you had Russia who put on export restrictions for the quantity of exports that could leave the country. To a certain extent, those are moot now because we sanctioned them, but leading up to this and during this time period, exports were restricted. And again, why are all these global things important? Because generally, fertilizer prices converge globally. So here you can see as of March 11th, these are just some various prices globally for urea, DAP, and for potash. So in some cases, you see the United States, the Corn Belt may be paying a little bit more. Other places we're paying we have a discount, or we're paying less than what's happening globally. These prices fluctuate throughout the week, and so it just kind of depends on, like I said, at what point in time and what locations and what product. But again, this is a global market, and U.S. farmers, as with Brazilian farmers, as with Indian farmers, as with Chinese farmers, are going to have to pay the global price. And even though we are a large producer here in the United States, we are a fairly large importer because we do consume 10% of the global nutrients. So you can see we're the second largest importer of ammonia, second largest of potash, the third of urea, and the third of processed phosphates. So we do import, and again, we're connected to that global market. So those are probably 4 quick things on the supply side that really caused some challenges over the last 18 months between kind of the production planning with COVID and the turnarounds. You had the weather events that absolutely no one could control. You have these huge rise in input costs, and you also have all of these trade disruptions. That's on the supply side. At the same time, what did we see on the demand side? So as we all know, the demand for fertilizer is really driven by crop acreage, the expectation for what crop prices are going to be. In the United States, corn accounts for 50% of all fertilizer consumption. So corn price and therefore corn acreage is a big driver in the demand for fertilizer. So in August of 2020, when my uncles in Minnesota were getting their combines ready to go out into the field and harvest their crop, that would be not this last crop, but the crop before, the USDA was projecting the season average corn price for the following year to be $3.10, which was the lowest season average corn price since 2006, 2007. So as they're harvesting their crop and they're looking towards this last planting season in 2021, not a great outlook, so probably a little bit of a weaker demand. Fast forward 6 months, so in February of 2021, so almost exactly a year ago, when farmers were getting ready to plant their crops for last year, all of a sudden USDA now is projecting the highest season average corn price since 13-14. So in a span of 6 months, there was a significant turnaround in the market, and there was really strong demand because farmers were hoping to capitalize on these higher prices. So whether it was planting additional acreage, adjusting application rates to try to maximize yield, those things were then all of a sudden being done in 2021, while at the same time we had all those supply impacts that I just talked about. So demand's increasing and supply is decreasing. And what does that naturally do? That puts that upward pressure on price. Additionally, one thing we see today is a continued forecast for this year for high or strong crop prices. And so what that probably means is that, while some folks may have to pull back because of fertilizer prices, there's probably a floor on how far that comes down in terms of demand because fertilizer prices, because crop prices remain strong. So just as a quick reference point as wrap up today, want to just have a quick look back. So this was the chart that I had originally shared with where prices are today. And many of you who are around probably experienced the 2008 kind of increase in fertilizer prices. You can see it here on the chart. So potash and phosphates were higher in 2008 than they were today, but nitrogen is higher today than it was at that point. And so I think, I'll talk a little bit about what's different between 2008 and today, but I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is what makes this rise in prices even more difficult is where we came from. Between 2016 and the beginning or middle of 2020, we were experiencing kind of some all-time consistently low fertilizer prices over that time period. So, growers and my uncles and folks, they got used to or kind of, we're in this space where they were anticipating the prices to stay relatively the same or where they were at. And so that makes this change in price, this increase in price, even much more dramatic because of where we came from. And in looking back to the differences between 2008 and the current, obviously in 2008, we had the global financial crisis that impacted ag markets, but also just impacted the economy in general. Leading up to 2008, we also saw significant demand growth. So we saw an additional 1.5 US demands put on the global market, primarily from China, India, and Brazil. So we had this huge increase in demand for fertilizer, naturally putting upward pressure on price. We also saw, crop prices were high, but then there was a significant and quick decrease in crop prices. Crop prices fell out of the kind of fell through the floor, and we saw a significant increase or decrease in demand. So during that time, I think we saw nitrogen application decrease 7%. I believe phosphates was around 23%, and potash was 33%. So in terms of both percentage and absolute basis, the biggest decrease in demand we'd ever seen. Fertilizer prices were high, crop prices came down and were very, very low. Therefore, farmers didn't put on as much fertilizer. So how does that 2008 experience, where it went up and then it crashed very quickly, compare to today? So today, as we kind of talked about, there's just a global pandemic and a ton of supply chain challenges and pressures that are happening. What's different, one of the different things is that really is supply side related, whereas in 2008, we saw a lot of demand driven kind of factors in the market. Additionally, today, we haven't seen crop prices decrease quickly and significantly as they did in 2008. So with those, that will, again, probably keep a little bit of a floor on how far demand will drop. And then, so, we would probably anticipate that demand destruction will, again, be relatively small as these crop prices remain strong. So hard to know, we always get the question of where the price is going to go. Unfortunately, as a trade association, we're not able to project future prices, but, things to watch definitely would be, where our crop price is going, what's going on globally. So obviously what's happening with Russia, China's export bans are through June. So if they come back to the market in June, that could provide some significant relief. Are there additional countries that are going to ban fertilizer exports? How does that send a ripple effect? What happens with energy costs, specifically in terms of natural gas, both globally and domestically, will be important. And then, what significant weather events or lack thereof could help production run at full bore and potentially provide some relief. So again, I know I went through that. I sped through that very, very quickly. But that's just kind of a high level overview. TFI, we represent, everyone from the producer to the wholesaler, retailer, manufacturer, the whole supply chain. So we've been, in close contact with folks all the way across. We've been getting a lot of questions, obviously, with everything that's going on with Russia. We've been able to share a lot of information, both with Capitol Hill, with our members, with the press, with the media. So we recognize that this is a really challenging time for growers. It's making, as things are changing even now, very, very difficult, very difficult for as we go into this planting season. So it's a challenging time. We're doing our best to share as much information as we can. So I'll pause there. I'll stop sharing. If there are questions, if we have time, I would welcome questions, and I'll do my best to answer.
Thanks, Jason, for that great presentation. That was really helpful to see everything in one place to understand, and also looking back historically at 2008 and the similarities and differences that we're experiencing. If anyone has questions, please feel free to raise your hand or enter them in the chat. I'll start us off with one question. So you might be aware of the Temporary Relief from Tariffs Act that has been introduced in Congress, looking at temporarily for, I think, up to a year, suspending tariffs on agricultural imports, including fertilizer. So any idea or analysis of the percentage of the cost that tariffs represent in general on different imports right now?
Yeah, no, really good question, Lindsay. I think we've gotten this question. I think the challenge is, as we alluded to, because of the multitude of factors, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to attribute what does one impact, have on the specific price. And so it's hard to know, for example, the Chinese ban on exports. How much has that driven up phosphate prices? Because you take 25% off, or 25% of the global market away, relative to something like the tariffs. So I think it's challenging to know exactly what that is. Just in general, from TFI's standpoint, we remain neutral on issues related to trade cases, because we have members who are actually on both sides of this, both importers as well as domestic producers. We just really we advocate for free trade, and we acknowledge that there are processes in place on both sides in terms of trying to get an investigation to have tariffs applied, as well as a process that goes through the World Trade Court to potentially revise or investigate if those need to then be removed. So, but yeah, to your point, it's really difficult to know exactly how much of the price is relative to the tariff versus everything else. Unfortunately, there's probably 10 different factors, and so what size of the pie each of those have, it's hard to know.
Thanks. I figured I'd ask.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
All right, any other questions for Jason? Looking here through our participant list. I guess the one other question I'll ask, not so much related to pricing, but more so availability. So one of the things we as the 4R Alliance have been talking about and concerned about is whether or not the lack of assurance of availability later in the season, specifically on nitrogen, is going to impact 4R implementation. So what are you hearing from the importer and the retailer side as far as availability through the spring into the early summer?
Yeah, good question. So we don't have any data that would indicate that there is going to be any widespread shortage for this spring. Now, with that being said, there's always the challenge of, is the product in the right place at the right time when the grower needs it, right? Because just because something is sitting in Florida or Pennsylvania or Iowa doesn't necessarily mean that it's, that's helpful, right? And so I think as with every year, we may see, temporary local disruptions where whether it's a truck driver shortage that we can't get there, whether it's the CP rail strike that brings in a lot of our potash from Canada, there could be, issues with getting things at the right time. But in terms of, is the product there? Yes. And it's a matter of if we have a nice spring and we can focus on the southern part of the US and get that all supplied, get everything moved to the right place there and then slowly work our way north, that would be really awesome. If we get a wet spring in the south and all of a sudden everybody needs it all at the same time, that obviously puts strain on the logistical side. But again, we don't anticipate and we don't have any data that would indicate that there's a widespread, kind of shortage of in any way on the nitrogen side as well as on the phosphate and the potash side. Now, when we get to next fall and into the next planting season, that could potentially pose some additional challenges depending on how everything sorts out with Russia. But for this planting season, we feel like we're at least in okay shape.
So Mike Twining with Willard Agri-Service is asking about the status of the temporary relief bill that I had asked about particularly, and the likelihood that something can be done this season to increase UAN shipments, particularly out of Trinidad.
Yeah. Good question. I'm an economist. I'm not a policy guy, but I am in DC, and I have gotten to get into that realm a little bit. I think it's a good question. The biggest thing is whether or not that will go anywhere when it comes to Congress. And at this point, if someone told you with any level of assurance that it would or wouldn't, I think they're just guessing, based on kind of the current political situation or scenario that's happening on Capitol Hill. So unfortunately, Mike, good question. I don't know if I have an answer at this point in terms of whether or not that's has got legs to it and will go anywhere or not. I will say, I guess the only other thing that I would mention on the UAN side specifically is you've probably seen some of the announcements from CF, but they are making a concerted effort to move from urea production to UAN production to help try to fill in some of that gap. So I think they've made some public announcements in that regard. But relative to the bill, not sure if it'll go anywhere.
That would have been my answer as well. So the bill has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. We have not seen movement in either chamber on that bill. But just understanding the pace at which things have been moving through Congress for the last several years, I would say it's unlikely that something will happen before the season this year. So I would agree with Jason on that one. All right, last call. Any other questions for Jason? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Jason, and thank you to all of our other presenters today. We're going to leave the meeting open here for just a few minutes because Janelle has put in the chat the links again for Delaware as well as all others. The edited version of this meeting will be available on the Mid-Atlantic for our channel for CCA credits into the future. And Janelle is going to check with each of our presenters about the availability of their slide decks. So if you registered through Eventbrite, we will provide the slide decks that are available through that platform. And with that, I would just like to thank everyone for their time today and hope you had a good meeting and learned something useful. I know that I did, and look forward to talking with you guys all in the future. So again, I'm going to leave the meeting open here for a little bit so that you guys can access that chat, and we'll close it in about 5 minutes. Thank you.